Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are tired of picking between the lesser of two evils and news presented in either red or blue, welcome to your safe space, because every week we discuss the structural issues driving dysfunction in Washington and what we can do to fix it. Now, last week, Americans got a masterclass in the art of the deal when the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs on our trading partners, only to roll them back after the markets cratered and bond yields spiked. Now, the administration has claimed victory, saying this was all part of a grand strategy targeting China, which raises the question as to why they didn't just target China in the first place. But while the economics of Trump's policies might be questionable, the bigger question is what are the political consequences of this, and whether this might be an end to the blank check congressional Republicans have given him on policy writ large. We're going to deep dive into that today, so buckle up, amigos. But first, Shawn, I want to welcome you back after your 2-week hiatus.
Well, thank you.
Which was mainly my fault, so thanks for rolling with it. I have to say, I know for the most part, we do this in audio. Shawn has come back with a beard, and it really suits you, Shawn.
Oh, well, thank you. It gets mixed responses from people, but some people like it, some people don't.
Yeah, as a bearded gentleman myself, I will say it's polarizing.
Yeah.
My wife hates my face. So when we got married, I didn't have a beard, and then I grew one. I mean, I think we were married close to 10 years when I grew my beard out. And then I shaved one day, and she made this sound that was a combination of a gasp and an ooh.
Yeah.
And then I walked upstairs, and my kids all pointed and laughed at me. And that was the last time I ever shaved.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I think normally I keep my hair cut short, but if I grow my hair out a little bit longer like it is now, I think the beard works for me a bit better.
100%.
And I would say that that's a general rule for a lot of people. Like you yourself, you have longer hair.
Yeah.
So and the beard works for you. So that's maybe just a common thing.
Yeah. I think the beard and the short hair sends a different message. I don't know. I mean, I pretty much just like at this point it's whatever my wife likes, and she likes my hair longer and my beard longer. So you know what? I'm just going to roll with that. So let's jump into, this week for us, last week for the listener. What happened? I'll run through a quick timeline. So April 1st, Trump announces a new round of tariffs using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, otherwise known as the IEPA. April 2 is dubbed Liberation Day. This is when a 10% tariff on all imports is imposed, 50% reciprocal tariffs on all countries. And of course, the days that follow, the stock market drops, S&P 500 drops nearly 5%. NASDAQ sees its biggest loss ever. Yields on the 10 and 30-year Treasury spike. And then on April 8th, Trump ups the ante with a 104% tariff on Chinese goods. China retaliates. And then April 9th, Trump announces a 90-day pause on most reciprocal tariffs except for China. So increases it to 145%. So the markets rally from that. Next day they drop. And the administration has now couched this as a victory. Again, saying the target was China all along. Shawn, I know you've done some reading into this. Like, what are your thoughts overall?
So I know a lot of people want to bring up the potential market manipulation here because Trump had put on Truth Social for people to buy in right now, like 4 hours before he made the announcement of the 90-day pause. And so following that, there was this over 2,000 point spike in the Dow, which, as you said later, was mostly erased the next day. Now, whether or not personally I think it's market manipulation is kind of irrelevant. However, I think the more suspect thing for it is the timing and when the stock market started to rise, which is right before the announcement, which would point to potentially some inside information being exchanged and investors were ready to pump into the market again.
Yeah, that's right. So AOC actually put out a tweet about that where
Yeah.
minutes before the tariff pause was announced, call volumes, which is bets on the stock market rising for you liberal arts grads, went up. And so there's definitely a question as to who knew what when. AOC has come out and called for greater transparency around insider trading in Congress, which was an issue for her prior to this. But yeah, I find the market manipulation aspect of this really interesting.
The whole topic of public officials being able to trade, elected officials, when they're previewed to privileged information about what can affect the stock market, is certainly a matter worth discussing. And I think AOC's bill and the bill that she supports to rein in the ability to do any type of stock market trading while you're serving in Congress is worth considering. But anytime this has come up, it's been very hard for any case to go anywhere. So COVID is a good example of this. In December of 2019, you started to see members of Congress unload stock right before COVID started to get serious in spring of 2020. And so a lot of people took that as instances of insider trading, market manipulation, that they had the intel that things were about to get a lot worse. And so they were going to dump their stocks. But while there were investigations into this for some lawmakers, those investigations never went anywhere, which kind of just shows how loose the laws are right now and how easy it is to get around some of these policies.
Yeah, 100%. And I want to dive into the stock market specifically in a little bit. But before we get to that, I think it's important that we talk about why this is bad policy. And I'm not even going to both sides this. This is just unabashedly bad policy. And I heard it put best by this economist who said, when I go shopping at my local grocery store, I don't ask my local grocery store to buy an equivalent amount of economics research from me. That's not the way the economy works. And the global economy works in much the same way. You know, the net sum of all trade inflows and outflows equals zero.
Mm-hmm.
And it just goes between different countries. So a great example of this in action is Lesotho, which was targeted with a 50% tariff by the Trump administration due to their trade imbalance with the US. Now, the problem here is that that trade imbalance is caused by the fact that Americans buy diamonds from Lesotho. And Lesotho is a country of 2.3 million people. So it's not realistic to think that a country of 2.3 million selling diamonds to a country of 340 million is going to be able to buy enough American goods to balance the deficit. So economically, it's just stupid.
Well, and there's this whole conversation about how much thought was actually put into this. You hear the jokes about the McDonald's islands, right, where we tariff penguins. It's a joke. It's a funny thing to talk about, but it's also gets into a more serious conversation of how much thought was actually put into this plan just to invoke sweeping tariffs on countries around the world.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly it. And I think one of the things you and I talked about prior to this, and one of the things we've talked about in prior episodes as well, has been the fact that the checks on presidential power have been eroded over the years. And we'll get into this a little later on. It does seem as if there is more and more of an appetite to restrict the power of the president to take unilateral action, at least in the form of tariffs. One of the things that was really interesting that you brought up too was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. I know you did a little research into that. Could you explain that one to the listener? Because I think that's an important piece of all this.
So that bill, along with some other bills that passed in the 70s and going back to the Trade Expansion Act in 1962, included provisions that gave the president expanding and broader authority on tariffs and trade, which the Constitution gives that authority specifically to Congress. Now, at the time, there wasn't even a consideration that someone like Trump would come into office. Lawmakers trusted the president to use his discretion wisely in an economic policy that actually favored free trade over tariffs, right? And so some of these things, like for instance, the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 included a provision, Section 232, which gives the president the authority to invoke tariffs on goods that pose a potential risk to national security.
Mm-hmm.
Trump has used this section of this law as well to justify his tariffs, both his first term and his current term. At the time, that wasn't a headline section of the bill. It was more of a safety valve of Cold War logic that if the Soviets or aligned countries wanted to target U.S. industries to weaken us, the president should be able to unilaterally act quickly. And since then, that law has not been invoked by a whole lot of presidents. There's only a handful of them. And Trump is the only one that has used it to impose sweeping and aggressive tariffs.
Yeah. And what we've seen is that congressional Republicans now have endorsed the idea of imposing some restrictions on the president's ability to levy tariffs unilaterally. So Chuck Grassley in the Senate, Don Bacon in the House as well, have both proposed legislation that would restrict Trump's ability to do this again. Trump has said he'd veto it, but it's interesting that a party that has more or less exhibited no independence from Trump is all of a sudden starting to show a little backbone.
It appears that lawmakers are starting to realize the consequences of what any president, not just Trump isn't the cause of this. Again, this is authority that's been given to the president by Congress themselves. And they're starting to realize that, wait a minute, we made the language a little too broad. We gave the president very few limits on what this authority actually is for him to do, authority that belongs to us. And so now they're taking a look at this and they're thinking, well, any future president could do the same thing for personal gain. They could use tariffs to manipulate the market. They could impose trade policy that benefits them or anyone else, whether they're Republican or Democrat. And so, yeah, even now, a lot of Republicans who have been very hesitant to speak out against Trump are on this issue.
One thing that's interesting about that, though, are the electoral incentives, because there are some interesting factors that indicate whether the rank and file Republican voter is going to really care. And there's a few of them here. The first one I'll get into is just the effect on the stock market. Okay, so Scott Bessent, one of Trump's chief advisors on this, was interviewed on Tucker Carlson, and he actually made a very good point, which is if you look at the stock market, 54% of wealth in the stock market is owned by the top 1% of households. And then the next 9% own 39%. So 93% of all wealth in the stock market is owned by the top 10% of households. And then the bottom 90% split the remaining 7%. Now, if you look at how the GOP has realigned demographically, the average income in over 60% of all Republican districts is below the national median. So these are the people least likely to have money in the stock market. And so I think there's a big question as to whether any initiative to protect the stock market is going to have broad support amongst the Republican rank and file. It might have support amongst Republicans in Congress. It might have support amongst their donors. But when you get to the voters, is that going to matter?
I don't know if the voters are really that concerned about the stock market. We saw, record highs with the stock market under the Biden administration, and that still didn't help the Democrats win back in November. But there's a lot of Americans who are more concerned about their own personal wallets than they are what's going on in the stock market because they're not invested in the stock market.
Yep.
So the impact that this has, I know Democrats like to point to how bad this has been for stocks, but I don't think that's a winning strategy for them.
I personally don't think that's going to affect at least GOP voters and GOP representatives at all. I'd even venture to say that if legislation designed to restrict Trump's ability to levy tariffs was perceived as a method of protecting the markets, I think you could almost see another Tea Party moment where Republican rank and file voters rise up and primary their representatives out of office. The other thing I'll note as well is for a long time, the stock market has been entirely decoupled from productivity. So the stock market gains that we see are largely due to the injection of capital in markets. First in 2008, and then again in during the COVID pandemic, right? And if you look now, the interesting thing that I see is that the stock market is really banking on low interest rates. And so they'll actually root against the American worker. Over the last couple of years, what I noticed is headlines would come out about the markets dropping due to a better than expected jobs report. So when more Americans were employed and more Americans were finding work, the stock market didn't like that. And so we could go down a whole rabbit hole about this. We don't necessarily have to do that. But I think, the bottom line here is your average American and definitely your average Republican voter isn't necessarily going to care so much about the stock market declining. They'll care about bond yields because that'll impact car payments and mortgage payments and all that stuff. Now, part two of these global incentives is the role China is playing in all this. And ahead of this conversation, I did a little research. One of the memes going around in regards to trade policy shows a decline in manufacturing starting around like 1960 or so and going steadily down until the present day. And they have this little arrow that says China joins the WTO. And the whole premise of it is to say, well, China didn't really have an impact, which is partially true. So the vast majority of job losses in U.S. manufacturing have been due to automation, about 88%, according to my research. So the remainder was due to globalization. But that remaining 12% was very regionally focused. So there were regions that disproportionately felt the impact of China's entrance into the World Trade Organization. And the Rust Belt was especially affected by it. So there were 206 counties in the United States that voted for Obama in 2008, 2012, and then flipped to Trump in 2016. They're called pivot counties. And these counties were overwhelmingly located in regions affected by China's entrance into the World Trade Organization. It accounted for about 5% of all votes cast in the election, but that's more than you needed in 2016 or 2020 to win. Now, the Rust Belt accounted for almost 40% of those counties. And so I think when we look at the electoral incentives here, Trump isn't necessarily going to lose because of the stock market. He'll lose because of the economy. He's not going to lose because of the stock market. He'll win on China because the places he needs to vote for him have been the most negatively affected by China and are going to be the most responsive to somebody who they view as standing up to China. And I found that really interesting.
Republicans right now know that they need those blue collar manufacturer workers in the Midwest and in states like Pennsylvania, because without them, they won't win future presidential elections. So now when you hear them sell these tariffs, they're talking about increasing manufacturing jobs. Very similar to the way Obama sold the tariff that he put on Chinese tires back in 2008. He sold it as saving manufacturing jobs, which he did in the short term. He saved 1,200 jobs or so, but at the expense of 4,000 retail jobs. So now you fast forward to now with Trump, he is selling this as, hey, we're going to be able to make iPhones here in America. Sure, it's going to cost consumers thousands of dollars to do it, but hey, it's going to bolster our manufacturing industries. But that comes at the expense of farmers who are getting greatly affected by these tariffs on China. You have all these exports that we have from our agricultural industry of, say, soybeans and pork that are going to be diminished as a result of this trade war. And let's make no mistake, we are in a trade war with China right now. And Trump's kind of reaction to this, as it was in his first term, was, well, these are typically loyal Republican voters, and we could just say, well, we'll give you a bailout, right?
Yeah.
A multi-billion-dollar bailout.
Well, and this is really interesting to me because to get to the structural issues behind what's going on, we have to remember there are two types of voters out there for the Democrats and Republicans. There's winnable and there's non-winnable. So, great example is the Rust Belt. For years, working class voters in the Rust Belt, who were primarily union households, were unwinnable to Republicans, right? They were diehard Democrats. So the Democrats could depend on those people to vote for them. Now, the Republicans, because their votes weren't winnable, actively worked against unions. That was part of their policy, right? And the Democrats, for their part, kind of played lip service to them. So they'd come around every election cycle, say they're going to fight for them, but they still embraced these multilateral trade agreements without doing anything to address what that was doing to the communities who were voting for them. And so Trump picked up on that in 2016 quite astutely and took advantage of it. And now this unwinnable voting bloc is winnable again. It's persuadable. Yeah. And this is why you have, both Democrats and Republicans battling over, the proverbial white working class voter. Now, the interesting thing is that Trump appears to be doing to the Farm Belt what the Democrats did to the Rust Belt, which is he can depend on folks in rural agricultural regions for their votes. And so he can kind of use them as pawns in this trade war. And look, nobody wants a bailout, right? The auto industry bailout didn't do anything for the Democrats in the Rust Belt, despite the fact it saved jobs. A farm bailout isn't going to do anything for farmers. People want to be able to have control over their own destiny. And part of that is being able to go out and make money off your labor.
I know a lot of farmers don't like this idea that they could potentially lose their farms altogether before these bailouts come. So Kentucky Senator Rand Paul has consistently been against tariffs. He's a free market libertarian, and that's always been the case. And one of the reasons he gives for being against tariffs is he doesn't think government should be in the position of picking winners and losers. Well, the current system that we have incentivizes the major parties to pick winners and losers with voters. And so right now they see who the winnable voters are for them, who mathematically they need to get the edge over the opposing party. And so they target only specifically them at the expense of other voters, in this case, farmers, right? So it really just speaks to how the current system incentivizes the two major parties to speak to only small segments of the electorate rather than appeal to an electorate at large. And as Rand Paul also said, if your tariffs are going to hurt farmers, the solution shouldn't be, we're just going to bail you out. No, the solution should be to stop the tariffs.
Yeah, 100% agreed. And I think there's also another issue here. Getting back to something I brought up earlier. So those pivot counties we talked about, counties that swung from Obama to Trump, comprised 5% of all voters. Mm-hmm. If we look at the last election, both candidates were competing for razor-thin margins in 3 states. And yet a much larger group of people are going to suffer for these policies in an attempt to win that slim margin of voters in those swing states. So everybody is going to pay higher prices. Everybody will suffer from capital outflows from the United States and from decreased foreign investment in the United States. We won't all suffer equally from losses in the stock market. We will all suffer equally if foreign investment is depressed, which this may very well do. And it's all for the sake of winning a very small portion of voters affected by one policy.
Yeah. All for electoral math.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that just goes to highlight the problem here. Mm. I mean, you and I have talked about this before, that one of the big issues now is that because the parties can afford to ignore micro constituencies, very often problems have a chance to metastasize into something horrible. Mm. And if we really want to look at the impact of our current electoral system on the country, look at the Rust Belt. We've had massive unemployment. Families have broken up. An opioid epidemic. I mean, I don't even know. Does Flint have drinkable water? Right? Right?
Yeah, right.
And that is the impact of a system that can afford to ignore voters, can afford to take voters for granted. And, you and I talk about a lot of different reforms. My preferred solution, I've said this a million times before, make it easier for smaller parties to form, make it easier for these folks to splinter off from the major parties when they're not delivering. Proportional representation by far, I think, is the gold standard.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to ignore smaller groups when those smaller groups also have a seat at the table.
Yeah, exactly. And so my hope here is that there's going to be a focus on the structures of governance. I think one of the clearest signs we see is congressional Republicans being more willing to put restrictions on presidential power. That's a good first step. That's a good start. I think another thing coming up, this is kind of unrelated, but I think is worth bringing up because it kind of factors into this whole idea of the power mechanics in the U.S., is an article came out in Politico this week talking about Ted Cruz and talking about some recent moves he's made to elevate his presence. So he's made a couple moves that have angered the White House, spoke out against Trump's tariff plan, took on big tech. He's also done some moves within the Senate via his committee chairmanship to elevate his presence as well. And all of this is seen as laying the groundwork for a 2028 presidential run. Now, the interesting thing I see here is that, there's a lot of talk about Trump wanting to install himself as a permanent president or turn the White House into another Trump franchise where he'll just appoint one of his sons or his daughter as president. And I think one of the interesting checks on power we don't talk about enough is the fact that in American democracy, and all democracies for that matter, those with an insatiable lust for power are just pitted against each other, right? Mm-hmm. And so Cruz isn't the only Republican who wants to run for president in 2028. And if Trump starts to make moves to quash their ambitions, you can bet they're going to fight that. And does that fight take the form of a primary? Does that fight take the form of a third-party bid? We don't know.
Yeah, so anyone who says that 2024 was our last presidential election, I always say that is extreme hyperbole, because while Trump certainly is an ambitious person, he is now in an industry of a lot of ambitious people who want to one day be president, right? So even Republicans will not stand for this idea that we are just going to toss out presidential elections or install a permanent dictator, because they too want their turn at being present, being in these higher offices in the country. And so, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Ted Cruz runs in 2028. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the 2028 GOP field doesn't look dissimilar from the 2016 field, where you have Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Marco Rubio. You throw in J.D. Vance in there as well. And some of these other people that you saw back then may actually come back. So, yeah, I think you're right. One of these aspects to democracy we don't talk about is the fact the thing that keeps democracy going is that the people who want power will make sure they have that chance always.
Yeah, absolutely. Shawn, I'm going to say you nailed the dismount on that one. We are going to end it there. Thank you very much for listening. And before you go, if you liked what you heard today, Shawn and I have a small favor to ask. Shawn and I started this podcast because we knew there were people out there who were feeling politically homeless and wanted a way to escape the red versus blue dynamic that has gotten us into this mess. And we feel that if we build up a critical mass, we can get enough people to take real action and change the system for the better. And so we have a couple of simple requests. The first, if you like this episode, please rate it and please leave it a review. That'll help us appear higher on podcast platforms and get in front of more people like you. Part 2, if you know more people like you, which I'm pretty sure you do, Send this along to them. That'll put us one step closer to our goal. The music you're hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you once again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.